Greetings, amigops, and top teners everywhere. Welcome back to another edition of Top 10 with Kyle and Mike. I am your co-host, Kyle. Opposite me today, as he is every week, is your co-host, Michael. He's looking very good. His quarantine haircut is growing in very nicely. He's got his hands in the air like he simply just does not care. I think that's reflective of his attitude. Now, very importantly, it's not just Michael with me today. It's our good friend Alex. He's back for another guest appearance. You might remember him very recently from his Tom Hanks episode. Now, this is normally the part where I say we're going to be talking about some kind of top 10 list. But today we're going to break from our normal format a little bit to talk about something very important in our minds. And so for those reasons, we're going to play with our format a little bit and kind of have a more open, engaged discussion on a topic that Alex has researched a bit for us. So without further ado, Alex, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, happy to be here. We're talking, the simplest way to put it, we're talking about the state of the world in relation to, some of the protests that are happening right now, the Black Lives Matters movement. Just everything that's going on right now as a result of, the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis.
So I think before we kind of launch into the Alex piece of this, I think I want to say a couple things. One, this is the most important thing. Alex is going to downplay his own expertise because that's what Alex does. But Alex is extremely knowledgeable about this topic. He's very engaged in current affairs. He is one of our important ears on the ground here on this podcast. He keeps us up with what's going on in current affairs and the San Francisco 49ers. So that's one thing that's important. The other thing that's important is I think Kyle, I'm going to speak for us, but you can jump in and correct me. I think Kyle and I would both say we are on the side of people who are trying to do their part in the world, trying to be good citizens, and specifically trying to be good white people in a world where, that's not the case for everybody. But I think we would both acknowledge the limits of our education on topics that really matter. And I think we also really acknowledge the limits of giving a shit. Giving a shit is nice, and we both give a shit. But giving a shit without translating that into, affecting real change is not very helpful. And so I think that's part of why we wanted to enlist Alex to help us, is because Alex is somebody who actually has taken his given a shit and converted it into really doing things for other people. So I think that's a big part of what we're trying to do here. And I suspect we'll probably do this a few more times in the coming weeks as we kind of try to figure out how to convert our, couple of goobers who like Lord of the Rings in a generally kind-spirited way into being better citizens of the world.
I think we both spent a lot of time recently trying to educate ourselves because as far as a lot of these topics go, the only education you're going to receive is the stuff that you actively pursue, which requires energy and intentional thought. And so I think that's one thing that you can do and what we're trying to do here. And I think Alex is, like you said, a really good source for that. I think another hopefully positive outcome of this is that I feel like most of these conversations happen through larger media sources, and these kinds of conversations don't always happen as often as they should between friends, and this is a good opportunity for us to kind of have a discussion and hopefully encourage others. It's not like thousands of people listen to this podcast, but if it's a way to make other people start to think about these topics from that point of view, I think that's a good thing.
And I think, the important thing is we know our demographics. Our listener base is generally people who are like us, and that's 20-something white people who care about their black and brown brothers and sisters, who approach the world with empathy and who are generally educated, but who are looking for ways to do more. And I think it's important we approach the topics with humility because there's a lot of stuff we don't know. And I think that's why Alex is a helpful source for us because, like I said, and I can't reiterate this enough, Alex is a person in our lives who jokes about not giving a shit and actually gives a shit and acts in giving a shit kind of ways that are very real. So we really appreciate that about Alex. We like to make fun of him on this podcast, but he's one of those people who actually lives out good works in his real life.
Oh, thanks, guys. Don't make me blush.
Like I said, he's going to downplay his own ability to educate
I am
us.
going to downplay because I have been doing so much reading and research and conversations with people just, of all backgrounds, and it's just, it's overwhelming. It's stuff that for the longest time, I've thought, there's been systemic racism just at a lot of levels, housing, education, healthcare, I've always thought these things, but I didn't really, I had done some very preliminary research, and I would still categorize what I'm doing now as preliminary research. Like, I have some numbers and statistics and things like that to kind of pull from to inform my opinions. But I still feel like it's just an overwhelming vast, like, how do you, like, it takes forever to become an expert on what I consider to be like decades, if not hundreds of years of neglect, neglect on behalf of like our federal and state governments that are supposed to empower our people or make them feel safe and protected and enable them to pursue the opportunities that they rightfully deserve in this country. And it's hard to kind of take in at once. And it's just like, it's not pleasant reading. And especially like right now at a time of like, still trying to live a lockdown life and still trying to like, find happiness in here and there. This is like very, it's tough to read. And I'm like, look, I'm not black. I don't know what it's like to be a black American. I've experienced racism. And so I've definitely felt like, I've internalized a lot of that negative feeling and energy that comes from, racist encounters, that informs like my philosophy and my attitude about, things that relate, like relations to this, but I will never understand what it's like to be black, but I can maybe, offer some insights just as to like what I've maybe gone through, or just like I can feel the frustrations, or like I can understand like when racism happens, it really puts a person into a mood like that is almost indescribable. Like it's like, for me, it's put me through a lot of like near existential like crises about like just, my worth as an American, or my value as an American, as a person in general. And it really attacks that, and in a way that you can't even like rationalize, because what is racism except, but just something that's so hard to really comprehend, when you're like someone who's been afflicted by it.
Well, and it's also something that's impossible to understand, like, unless you've experienced it. So like you can try to empathize and, like try to understand it, but until you've actually felt it, it's hard you can't understand it. And I don't want to speak for you, Mike, but like as a white straight male, like it's hard to come across that kind of experience, at least for me.
Ultimately, I would say my view of the mission statement of trying to talk to Alex, and then we've got a couple other people we've kind of talked about who we think might be helpful for us to chat with. I think we have no patience for people who don't have empathy, people who are openly and overtly racist. No time for them. There's no time for them on this podcast. We're not friends with people like that. We're not interested in being friends with people like that. So no time for those people. So we're not here to teach empathy and teach people that they need to care. I think we would hope that that's something we can take for granted. I think what we really want to talk about is how to face down that sort of overwhelming wall of shit that Alex is talking about, those years and years of institutional neglect of a significant portion of our population. Like, I think it's daunting to look at that as somebody who cares, and will assume, and I think rightly, that everybody listening cares. It's daunting to look at that wall as somebody who cares and say, well, what am I supposed to do? And it's hard to do that and look at that and not just give up. And so I think just, Alex, you opened on a slightly a negative note there about like, what do you do? I think the important thing is you don't have to educate yourself on hundreds of years of institutionalized racism. You got to do a little bit better. You have to educate yourself, and we're not, it's not to pat ourselves on the back too much, but any sort of step towards educating yourself more and making you a better citizen that's a positive thing. That's only a positive
thing.
Thing.
For sure. I could definitely be a little bit hard on myself in terms of like my own, like, input and the output that I get from it. But I guess I'm just someone that wants to understand as much as there is as possible about, any issue. And before,
that's why you're so good on Reddit.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, got a huge Reddit presence, man. But yeah, when you asked me to, have this conversation, the first thing that, we were going to talk about is like implicit bias training. And that was just like the first thing that came to my mind in reaction to like, just what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis. We're just like, okay, we really have to, like, what is implicit bias training? I heard the phrase and it's just like, it came up in my head. I'm like, there needs to be more of this if there isn't. And so I actually like did some pretty good research just about what police do in terms of training for implicit bias. And, I don't know how to characterize it per se. I think like the general vibe that I get, it's been a recent development. I think as far as 2015 was when, there was like a bigger push because there were a lot in that year specifically, there were a lot of, nationalized, like on the news, like police killings of black people. And so that was like one of the pushes that people were urging for or asking for. And so there was a response, but it wasn't, from what I've read and, learned about the response, it doesn't seem to be super comprehensive.
Alex, can I interrupt you really quick? I just want to make sure that Kyle and I and the audience are good on just understanding our structure and where we're going. So we're going to talk about sort of implicit bias as like our first topic and then we'll move on to another topic. What's the roadmap here?
I think I guess I would like kind of show you my roadmap of just like from the start of everything that's happened till now and just like my own personal progression in terms of understanding everything. And the first thing I did do research on was on implicit bias training. And then following that, it was about just reading about an FBI report that investigated the, kind of strategic infiltration of the police force by like white hate groups such as the KKK and other organizations such as this. And then I'd like to kind of just move into maybe talking about like what's being discussed right now, which is like defunding the police and what benefits that could have. And it's just, I want to kind of just preface everything I'm about to say is like, just again, I've been doing a lot of reading about this last few weeks and I've had some, very preliminary understandings of just this whole issue prior to some of the incidents that have happened in the last few weeks. But it just feels like there's still so many like holes into like information gaps. And it's just, this is a bigger topic than any three of us right now. And just even, it's a bigger topic than anyone that has like a PhD in African American studies or anything like that. This is hundreds of years of like neglect that's coming out right now.
I think you raise a good point that's, I think, important to just kind of reflect on briefly, which is just that when you're talking about a system that is pretty fundamentally broken, and I think not everybody would agree with that, but I think a lot of people are waking up to the notion that, a lot of our institutions are just broken. There's a lot of projection. There's not a lot of evidence. There's not a lot of data you can cite that's really persuasive that says, if we do this, this will happen. There's a lot of anchoring to old ways of doing things because we have a long track record of, okay, well, this model of policing, for example, has been around for a long time. We know what happens with that in place. It's pretty much impossible in lab conditions to tell yourself what will happen if we change that. And so I think there's just a natural inability to make a really clear conclusion. If we do this, then this will happen. I think that's okay. I think I'm pretty good with accepting that as, a condition to this conversation is nobody really knows what will happen if you put in a whole new system of things because there's a lot of unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think a lot of people that when they see a headline like defund the police, they get immediately scared. They're like, who's going to protect us then? And it's like, there's going to be, defund the police doesn't mean like get rid of all the police. It's just taking less of the, making it less of the police's responsibility to be like this one size fits all solution to a lot of like society's problems. Like police are supposed to handle, drug abuse, homelessness, poverty. And it's like their solution is just to like arrest people or push them into another, push the homeless into another subway cart. It's not enough. And so like when we say defund, it's just like we don't need to have the police do as much as they do. We don't need them to be as militarized as they are. Like there are police forces in this country that literally have tanks and military grade weaponry. It's not necessary,
Do you want to get into this, like specifically police defunding right now? Because if we are, you posted a really, really good NPR article on Facebook the other day that we should talk about in more detail. But I just want to make sure that, like, if we're just touching on this, we can come back to it later. But I want to get our structure organized because that's really compelling stuff that you posted the other day.
Let's just follow the roadmap. I think that's just easier because, yeah, let's follow the roadmap. So yeah, first thought was like implicit bias training, and so I just did a lot of research about like what that looks like and if police departments across the country are even doing it. And so I remember reading a CBS report where they polled a lot of they polled the police departments in every city, in every country, in every state, and they polled the police departments of the 3 largest cities in every state, and then some extra cities as well. So close to 180 police departments total did this survey. A lot chose not to submit, saying not to reveal any information. A lot did say that they are doing implicit bias training, and then they submitted what that looks like in their specific department. And so on average, I think what I saw was police departments will do about 4 to 8 hours of implicit bias training every 2 to 5 years. It's like,
Alex, I'm going to interrupt you real quick. I know I'm doing it again, but I just want to make sure we're all totally on the same page on what you're talking about when you say implicit bias training. I'm picturing, like, I remember reading articles in the early 2000s about video games that police officers would have to play where there's a black person and a white person, walking across the street. Do they shoot the black person, white person, both? Is that kind of what we're talking about?
That's the crazy thing. That's what I was thinking too when I think of these things. But like,
yeah,
the problem is that these guys, like, police departments regulate themselves on this stuff, and so what one police department does could very much be different from what another police department does. Like, I know one police department, like in the interview that I saw with these 2 cops from like Arizona, is that their implicit bias training was having a speaker come in and talk directly to the police force about kind of racism and the police, like in police enforcement, and just that was their example of implicit bias training. It could just be like a simple meeting in some places. It could be doing a survey in another. It could just literally be like a 1-question survey, and they just claim for it to be, like a couple hours or whatever. I think that's one problem right now, is that there's no standardized version of this. It's just like there's a lot of police departments in the country that do some form of it, but it's not very well vetted. It's not very well thought out, and more importantly, it's like they don't know how to measure the success of it because I don't think they're putting in any like considerable effort right now, because they don't because the very idea of having like an implicit bias test challenges the notion that we have like fair cops. If cops have to ask themselves,
there's a chance that you're going to find something that you don't want to find.
People in general are afraid to confront this about themselves. Like, are you ready to confront that you might have a bias against a certain group of people? No, nobody is ready to do that. And that's like in the interview that I watched with these 2 cops, like their faces were hidden, their voices were, they had that little funny voice change thing. And so, yeah, they had like the Darth Vader voice, and they were just talking about how like they found that the implicit bias training felt like lip service, and like the speaker that came through, like, they went in kind of guns blazing, was like, you're a racist. And it's just like, it's like, it's not like the 2 cops were like, it doesn't really affect, it doesn't really improve morale to hear this. And it's like, it's tough to hear that and like, be able to like work with it. But it's not like at this point with, lives being lost, it's not a matter of like whether or not you feel comfortable, whether or not, like, sure, it might hit morale, but if morale drops so that people's lives can continue and not, like, you don't shoot them or kill them, then so be it. But it's still like, you still do want to consider like how the police force will handle it. If they see it as, lip service, then we're not going to get the results that we want. It's like, it's a very long road to like get the results we want.
Is a problem that implicit bias training is not effectively standardized or implemented, or is a problem that even when implemented, implicit bias training is not actually found to be effective?
I'm afraid it's a bit of both. Like, the fact that there is no standardized version right now is a problem in itself, but then the problem could be that once we do have like a fairly well vetted standardized version, it might not be enough. Like, people are already saying that it's not enough, but I also don't think people know that like not very like versions of this aren't very well constructed right now. Because again, the police departments are in charge of creating these tests themselves and administering these tests themselves without any like regulation.
I would put this on the list, like in the world of options for improving policing practices in the United States, this is a low risk, kind of relatively low cost thing. Yes, it will cost a lot to implement sort of standardized nationwide implicit bias testing. Yes, it will cause, problems with police unions, blah, blah, blah. But in the list of options, this feels like pretty low risk, high reward. And if it doesn't turn out to work as effectively as we hoped, it's not a bad thing. It's funny. I'm really struck by this similarity to sort of a pop culture situation, which is the show Mindhunter, which is about it's a fictionalized take on the real life behavioral sciences unit within the FBI. And basically, it's this pioneering group that comes up with the idea of criminal profiling. And they were the first people who they coined the term serial killer. So basically, they were the first people to say, okay, not what is the physical evidence or what is the circumstantial evidence here, but what is my profile of the person who would have committed this crime? And a big part of the duties that they show them performing on the show and in real life was going around the country to various police departments and just training them on how to, use these criminal profiling techniques. And the lack of standardization was just their biggest challenge. It was an effective technique. There's problems with it, but it was a generally effective technique that just needed to be taught appropriately. And I think, I know that federalism is a pretty central tenet to the way a lot of people think about the United States and the way our system works. But part of the problem with, states' rights and local jurisdictions' rights is that, just go around the country. There's municipal police departments, there's county sheriff's offices, there are state police departments, there's national law enforcement agencies, and all of these groups have competing agendas, budgets, jurisdictions. Like there's just that patchwork of who's in charge of what and what are their goals, what is, what's incentivizing them, causes things like this to be really hard to put together.
There is no real incentive. The incentive should be to have a much safer society, but a society where police aren't killing people of all races at such a disproportionate rate. Literally 1,000 people every year get killed by the police in the U.S. and then 3 people in the U.K. get killed every year by the police. This is a problem, and they're not they're not willing to confront this head on. The police departments don't have that incentive to, because they're their own they're pretty much their own business. They're their own entity.
Yeah. Part of the issue here is that it's I think difficult to draw this line to a police department, but I would argue that less violence towards the communities that police departments are supposed to serve should, I would think, be mutually reinforcing and cause less violence towards police officers from the communities that they're supposed to be serving. So I think if you frame this as sort of a way to have improved relationships with your communities and a way for cops to feel safer, that's a good way of sort of, having people's self-interest, which is natural and human. It's important that we, understand that all these people who are acting within these systems are human and naturally self-interested. That would be a helpful way of framing it. I understand that that's hard and that's sort of a second order effect, but I think sort of trying to draw that out, it only seems logical. I think it only seems logical to me that if the communities that are served by these police departments feel safer around the police officers, there's less chance of violence towards those police officers. And that's a positive thing for everyone.
For sure. I think it's just the police force in general has this identity. They want to believe that they're this just presence in society. And then again, to unleash this, to really open up this can of worms and really dive into it could, reveal itself to be, not as great as it wants to think it is. And I think that's what really led me into the next topic that I researched about, which was just all the the presence of real racists, hate, white supremacists, extremists that are in our police force. And so I don't know if there's anything else about implicit bias training that you wanted to ask or just like follow up on. But anything at all?
Not for me. That just seems like if we're going to talk about ways to redistribute funds, this seems like low-hanging fruit. And at the very least, it seems like something with really, like you said, Mike, like pretty limited potential for negative consequences. And regardless of how effective it might be, like having the data points to assess that is important. But I think that's a good point to end that discussion.
And a show of faith on everybody's part. A good step.
Yeah, it's a good first step for sure. And just like, I think what people are doing right now as solutions, like I know in New York today, they just passed in the state assembly this law. It's called 50A. Basically, it protects like police transgressions and misconduct and keeps it as private instead of public. And so they just repealed that today. So now police transgressions can be public, and there could be more public scrutiny and stuff like that. And I think that's great, but that's also like, it's too reactive, like that means like if we only do that, then the problem will continue to persist, and then we can be like, okay, we saw him do that shitty thing. Now we can like do something about it. Whereas like I think with implicit bias training, or
I will say though, I think that so in my industry, so I'm in financial services, I have to register with a self-regulatory body. And with that comes the understanding that if I commit any securities violations, my record is public forever. And I think it's been shown, and I don't have any data to show right now, but my understanding is that it's been shown that has positive consequences, because you don't have this moral hazard issue where people think they're going to get away with it. I think people know that there's a light being shined on what's happening, and that has the power to alter behaviors going
That's
forward.
Totally fair.
There's plenty of perverse outcomes from anything you do, and there's perverse outcomes from something like that. But I think by and large, that has the ability to shape people's behavior.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good point. Like just having it public is a deterrent in itself, but I don't think it necessarily changes a person's like attitude. It just keeps the hate bottled inside, and then who knows? Like it might show up down the line, and they don't give a shit about the consequences, because like that hate could be so like blinding and overwhelming that they do a terrible thing. And so I think it's a good step, and like it's already a thing that happens in a lot of states. New York is just behind on it for some reason. And so they've repealed it today, but like an implicit bias training could be a good next step in terms of just being more proactive and preventative rather than reactive. But yeah, the next thing I did research about was just like I don't even remember how I came across this. I think I saw an article about it, and then I just did more digging, and then so I read this whole like paper from like Lewis and Clark Law School for some reason, just like details like all the police like transgressions relating to like just sending racist email, like racial slurs, like emails containing racial slurs, saying things on record, like audio recordings. Facebook. It's like there are like legit hundreds, and so basically this essay is just talking about how the FBI in 2006 did a investigation on the potential infiltration of the police force by the KKK and other hate groups, and they determined that it was like a threat to an imminent threat to national security, and then they kind of just left it at that. Like there was no like action taken by federal or state governments to do anything about improving our vetting process to make sure these guys aren't coming into the force. And I think it's just because the police, if you look at the history of the police, like they've always kind of just been like this, like historically it hasn't looked good for them. Like they started out as slave patrollers, like trying to find escaped slaves, and then they enforced a lot of like Jim Crow laws. They enforced a lot of they're the people that arrested Rosa Parks. These are like police traditionally have not been on the side that we wanted them to be on. And I think that just like historically just translates to where they are now, where like there could still be that legacy of racism at like a lot of at almost every level of police enforcement. And so what this like essay was saying is that there could be hundreds, if not thousands of police, not just individual officers, but also like chiefs of police that have like infiltrated the police force and have remained there. And it wasn't strategic at first, but like the more these guys started hanging out with each other, they're like, oh, you're a racist, I'm a racist too, oh, you should be a cop. And it was like, oh, that's just like that's how it kind of just that's how it could have started. And so yeah, there's I got like in one of these like articles I read, there was a cop that openly admits that he's a part of the League of the South, which is like a well-established, well-known like hate group. And the police force knew this about this guy, and they didn't do anything about it. They kept him in his town in Alabama, which is like pretty like diverse in terms of like just it has a lot of black people. There's a lot of black people there, and now they know there's openly a guy that's a part of like a hate group, and there's nothing happens to him. Like he got a promotion after that, and so like. And when like the police chief was interviewed as to like why that was the case, they're like, well, you know, we thought his affiliation with this group didn't impede his ability to, you know, be a cop. And it's like, well, that's the problem in itself. Like, how big of a problem is this across the country? And so, like, in this essay, there's just it's just a huge compilation, like across the country, even in like, you know, progressive cities, it's a problem. And so, yeah, that's just like the next thing I kind of dived into there.
I think one thing I would say, I think it's important we just note, you know, you were talking about cops being on the wrong side of history. I think it's important to just contextualize that a little bit, that the police act as a tool of their jurisdiction, whether it's the state or the federal government or whatever, the local government. And I think it's important to understand that, you know, when they were told to go catch slaves, it's because that was the policy of, you know, the state or whatever jurisdiction they were in. It doesn't excuse those actions, but it's important to just, I think, you know, it's important to think about the context of which laws they're enforcing. And when there's problems with the law, there's problems with law enforcement. I think we would agree, though, that the law has come a long way. Things like sort of decriminalizing or, you know, limiting mandatory minimum sentencing for, you know, nonviolent drug offenses, that's an indication that the law is getting better. And so better law needs to bring along better law enforcement with it. So I think that those two things kind of go hand in hand, and it's not fair purely to lay the blame on, I know that's not what you're doing, but lay that at the feet of the police. But I think it's interesting. You bring up the point about, you know, that police officer who, you know, his boss said, or his chief said, you know, it doesn't impede his ability to be a police officer. I had a conversation, I don't know, whenever the Ralph Northam thing happened in Virginia, where I think it's the governor of Virginia. There were pictures of him from graduate school. I think it was medical school in blackface. And basically what the conversation I was having was, wearing blackface at one time in your life does not make you a bad person. It does not make you a racist. It could, and in certain cases, it is indicative of a pattern of being a bad person or being a racist. It doesn't necessarily make you a bad person, in my opinion. But in a situation where you are seeking a public office to enforce important rules, to make important rules if you're a lawmaker, and especially when you're making or enforcing rules for people who are black, there are plenty of other good candidates who didn't do blackface. And this is my biggest problem, is the working in a police department. Now, I don't know about being a rural police officer in Alabama, but I'll say in my area, you know, working as a police officer, they get paid very well. Their benefits are excellent. Their retirements are excellent. There are plenty of people who would line up to take a job as a police officer, even understanding the risks, who don't belong to a hate group, who don't harbor these feelings. So I don't think this is a situation where we have to say, we need these people. There are other better people out there who we can find. Like there are plenty of people who, looking at, you know, weighing the costs and benefits, would love to serve their communities as police officers who don't have hate in their hearts.
I don't think this is the point you're trying to make. And I'd really like to read this study that you're talking about, because it sounds compelling and it sounds well-researched. And compared to me, where I don't have any evidence of this other than like anecdotal experience and like general optimism, it's like, I just don't think, and again, I know this is not what you're trying to say. I don't think that like the majority of police officers are neo-Nazis or belong to hate groups. And to your point, Mike, like there are so many people that don't partake in behaviors or patterns of thinking like that police are streets and keep us safe. Like, but like, you're right. Like, you know, certainly, and it sounds like there's very clear evidence for this, like in an organization or a series of organizations as large as American policing is, like you have to be really careful about screening because like just from a pure number standpoint, if 0.5% of Americans belong to a hate group, and I don't know what, I'd made that up. My point is, even if it's a very, very small number, when applied to an organization that's hundreds of thousands of people strong, like pretty soon you end up with an alarming number of people that think that way. Maybe selfishly want to stipulate vocally that, like, I do not believe that represents like even close to a majority.
I wouldn't say that at all.
I think what's really important is, just remembering the amount of power vested in these various police agencies. Police officers, generally speaking, have the right to carry a loaded firearm and to discharge that firearm at their discretion with a very high bar to indict them, to prosecute them, and ultimately to convict them for using that weapon. That's a responsibility that, in my opinion, they need. I do believe that. I do believe that the police need to have that right and that responsibility. But that is a very hefty, important responsibility, and it needs to be, wielded very carefully and by people who we trust. In the same way that being a heart surgeon, you have great power over the people on your surgical table. You have the ability to, give life or death to that person. You need that responsibility. I think we need you to have that responsibility. And there needs to be a high bar to question the decision-making of a surgeon who's, performing open heart surgery. Because we need to protect them and make sure that they can do their jobs appropriately. But at the same time, for me to feel confident in them wielding that power, we really need to trust that they meet a high standard. And it's not asking anywhere near too much that they not be associated with the hate group.
I can't imagine any reasonable person would disagree with that. I think if you ask anybody, pro police, pro whatever, like, I don't think anyone believes that people associated with hate groups should be legally enforcing law, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think most people would agree with that. I think the reason why no action was taken is the same reason why not as much action was taken with implicit bias training. Because again, if you do this vetting, if you vet every single cop in the country and you find out they're out of the 800,000 policemen in this country, or you find out that even 2 or 3% of that were associated with the hate groups, that begs the question, how could you let them come in? How could you be so reckless? It translates to the number of lives lost because of this, because you were so reckless. And so they don't ask, I don't think they ask those questions. I tried calling my state senator. I talked with someone on their staff about this. I tried, I messaged a few advocacy groups just to have a conversation about this. I don't think it's the main point that people are trying to do right now. Cause you're right. I don't think it is a majority. It's not even a significant minority of more than 10%. Probably barely even 5% if we're being honest. But I still think it is a problem just because, and I think the essay that I read touches on just if you have this presence and there are a lot of cops that might not be racist, but they're surrounded by racist cops, and that it becomes a defining aspect of the police culture they work in. And so
that's a really important thing that I think I want to make. I'm glad you touched on that because I wanted to make sure we talked about this. Is there's two issues at kind of stake here. One is when a police officer becomes a police officer, there's a background check performed to make sure that they are not in a hate group. That I think it's clear. We agree. Any reasonable person would agree that that's something that's important. But we also need to consider the degree to which police departments, as they're currently structured, are they're subject to or vulnerable to radicalization. And that's a really important thing to think about. Is you can get people who come into the police department, either as, a normie or as potentially somebody who's vulnerable to radicalization, and they enter an environment that is really conducive to that. That's a problem. And part of the problem, I would argue, is that there's an attitude in this country where the police departments are considered by the police and by the communities that they're supposed to serve as being adversarial to those communities. They're supposed to protect and serve those communities, not police and be against that group. This is not the military. This is a public service that's performed for the citizens of our country. And I think where that attitude has slipped into something more adversarial, you have a lot of people who are young, they're male, they tend to be of similar backgrounds. You end up in a really good brew for people to be radicalized.
Are you done with that thought, Mike? I think, to me, what's more concerning, like, you can have the same effect without having people that are like card carrying members of hate groups. And like I feel like probably like your mindset can change if you're a part of a system that promotes like less overt kinds of racism. Like, did either of you read Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell? So he goes really into depth on the Kansas City style, basically like the precursor to like stop and frisking. And that like has become, in its inception, it wasn't so much, but has become like a very kind of like racially, what's the right word? Racially charged, motivated. Like that has become a form of kind of racism in our policing. And so like, let's say I joined the police and I'm not I'm not in a hate group. I'm not a racist, but if that's what I'm being trained to do, and I'm like enacting a policy that through no fault of my own, or maybe many of the people that I'm working with, you can become kind of indoctrinated in a culture that is more accepting of like these kinds of less obvious forms of racial profiling and just general racism. So like, at least for me, like some of that kind of stuff is potentially even more problematic. Cause I think that if you looked into it, and again, I don't have facts to support this, but like that kind of stop and frisk and like those kinds of that Kansas City style of policing is something that's been implemented in a lot of cities and states probably. But, and just to tie it back to what you were saying, like, I think that kind of behavior can come in multiple forms, like either on the surface, like overtly and, like blatantly racist, and sometimes in more subtle ways. So, I don't know if that's like a real point or not, but I just wanted to illustrate or point out that like there's more than one way to think about it.
Well, I also, Kyle, you raise a good point about sort of overt hate versus sort of more covert forms of hate. I think it's important, I'm sure you guys have noticed this, that a lot of sort of traditional symbols of certain political groups, sort of like just movements, ideologies have been co-opted by these sort of pseudo hate groups. And in a lot of cases by the police. I mean, you know, the thin blue line flag has become this big sort of flashpoint where people who, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but it's that black and gray kind of flag with the blue line in it. And it's on a lot of bumper stickers. And I think it's safe to say that if you ask any person with that bumper sticker, they'll tell you it's simply there to support the police. But that has become co-opted by hate groups. It's a fairly common hate symbol at this point. And this starts to get you into why this topic is so tricky is, you know, there's not a lot of police officers who show up at the office with their Klan robes on, even if there is a certain, and I know, and Alex, I'm sure you have more evidence.
They might not be showing up in their robes, but they will be showing up with tattoos. That's like the big thing in the art.
But this is what I'm saying. Like you know, the big obvious, you know, you get my point. Like the big sign over my head that says, "Hey, I am an overt racist." It's not something that people are dumb enough to wear. very often. But some of these sort of co-opted or borderline symbols are becoming more popular as ways of expressing, a pattern of beliefs that are not consistent with good policing, but which are much more publicly acceptable and which understandably are really hard to legislate as, the police chief, as the local government. Like, when you find out that, Lieutenant so-and-so has the thin blue line flag on their car, how can you credibly say anything other than that they're supporting the police? But there is a really logical argument that that's a sign that they're being radicalized.
Yeah. I think it's just the tolerance that we have, or, there should be like a zero tolerance for any hint or like suspicion that one might be affiliated with these groups. But it's like, it's not easy to kind of go in there and like, have these conversations and go through that process, like they'll say it's, they can argue free speech and like they're entitled to that. They can use that to protect keep their status, but it's...
Though there are plenty of places where constitutionally protected free speech are not applicable. And, I think in the same way that we don't allow police officers to slap political bumper stickers on their cruisers, having a tattoo of a hate group, I'm sorry, if you're a reformed member of a hate group, you're not in my police. You're not welcome in my police department. I don't care. There's plenty of other people who can join the police department who were never part of that and who don't have that.
I generally agree with that. Maybe in the city, in small rural towns, I don't know, man. I think that might be. I don't have that data. I think the perception of the police right now is like an all-time low. Like public trust and security in the police is low, and it's just. I was talking to a friend recently just about like how less and less good people join the army or join any sort of like public, security force because the reputation has like soured. It used to be that good people would join the army like way back in the day, like the 50s, 60s. The smartest people would go into like military in some capacity. But now the smartest people don't do that because they can make good money and not be, in any line of fire. Whereas before, they would it seems like the best money was in military in some capacity. It would be good career growth, but you would also be in a position where like you could get shot. And so, it could be the same thing with the police, it does have great benefits, but like, do you want to public perception is no longer on your side, especially like right now. And it was already kind of failing before because 2015 was the last time there were like multiple like shootings of black people at like very similar junctures of time. It's just I don't know, like maybe in the city there would be good people that are looking for a better opportunity in life, and being a police would be one, but in a rural town, I don't know.
I think I disagree with you on that. I think in general I want to be careful about implying that we think that the general quality of our police officers and like armed like our army is declining, because I think I see your point, but I don't think our military or police probably lack in terms of qualified good people, as you say, to staff them.
I would argue too that the model of the military and police that Alex, you are sort of advocating for there is problematic in its own way, in very serious ways, which is that you end up with sort of an aristocratic military or police class who do not look like, think like, or act like the people that they're supposed to be serving. And I think that is a positive outcome of, kind of changing perceptions of the police and the military. It's pretty common from generation to generation outside of the sort of professional military and police class for, groups that are, rising in America, immigrant groups, to join the military.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I don't think I was trying to come off like that. No, I'm not.
No. I know you're not, but I'm saying I think it's important to know that like there's some really good things about that. It's really good if there are more black and brown police officers. And I know you're not saying that. I'm clarifying because I know what you meant. I think it's really. There's some really good things about that, and I do have faith that given the appropriate set of, kind of incentives, we can get the right. There is enough of a backlog of people who would be excited to take on those jobs that we don't have to worry about running out of quality officers because we've rooted out the bad actors.
Okay, that's fair. like I was never knocking, just like, you know, even now, like right now, like perception, like a lot of like left-leaning people would skewer me for saying that I still think there are good people in the police force, but I still do think there are good people that join that want to do good. But I think it's just, I've been trying to push myself to like kind of speak of the police force as like an overall institution and focus less on like individual people. And that's just like, that's becoming very hard for like, you know, people, including myself, to really like have a conversation about. Because I went to a protest last week and I saw a lot of black cops, and I couldn't even imagine to being in the position that they're in right now, to like kind of just confront two aspects of their lifestyle, their lives, you know, their job versus, you know, their race is who they are. And so yeah, I know, I get what you're saying, and I do apologize if that's like, you know, in some way.
You don't have to apologize.
I want to clarify, Alex. I don't want to imply in any way that you're saying something bad about, you know, the way that the police force is being shaped. I think it's important. I don't know, maybe it is an unpopular opinion, or it's becoming this way, but I just think that, like, I think that in general, we have good people, and that the police force, it's very difficult, I think, given the way that people talk about issues today. Like, it's so divisive. It's very hard to say that you believe that like, it's hard to say that you think that the police as an institution need to be reformed without sounding like you're implying that the individuals that comprise it are all by definition bad, or vice versa. It's really hard to support individual police officers without coming across as supporting an institution that in general, like, very desperately needs reform. I think that it's hard to, this, like, the critical mass of like hundreds of years of history are shaping how a body this big functions. And even if the majority of the people inside that body are of a certain way, it's so hard to undo the critical mass of a body this large. And so I think, again, going back to the fact that, like, talking about these things has become extremely politicized, and, like, at the root of it, like, this isn't a political issue, but it's been politicized to the point where it's hard to talk about the police in general and individual police officers without grouping them in one bucket or another. So I want to make it clear that I understand that you're trying to do just that.
Yeah, it is unfortunate that this has become, you know, super, like, just a political talking point at this point to, you know, just further divide people on the issue. You know, it's hard to have like a straight up honest conversation about just the institution versus the individuals that make up the institution, because they're both, you know, like, it's individuals do make up this institution of the police force. And of course, obviously the police force is filled with these individuals. So it's like,
yeah, they're mutually reinforcing. Is part of, I think, what this conversation reveals is, you know, you do have to talk about the bad actors, like the clear bad actors within this, because they are poison within the system, and they poison other individuals, and the system poisons individuals, and it reinforces itself. And so it's naturally difficult. And, you know, I'm sure if for whatever reason some big national network happens to be listening to our podcast, they can pull out plenty of clips that will sound really snappy and make us look like a-holes. And, you know, I think we have to be willing to accept that, because, you know, we're trying to wrestle with a difficult topic. And this is very complicated. I think, you know, the political point is really interesting too, because I think fundamentally, I'm going to put words in the entire nation's mouth, always a risky proposition. I think we would all agree that our nation is formed for the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not for any of the things that accomplish that. Like, our government is not an end in itself, nor is the police, nor is, you know, local city councils, nor is the military. Those things are means to an end. Nobody cares fundamentally about the police. Nobody cares fundamentally about the U.S. Treasury. We care about those things in as much as they help all of us in our pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. That's the point. And it's not political to want people to have access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. whether you think the best way to help them with that is through a big empowered police department or a small disempowered police department or no police or whatever, like those conversations are genuinely worth having because they're not easy to solve. But I think the end point we're trying to solve for, it simply isn't political.
Yeah, I agree. But unfortunately, people will make it so. And like,
it doesn't help when our leaders are the ones doing that, right? Like that's how it goes.
Yeah.
And that's both sides, to be clear. I want to make it extremely crystal clear that both ends of the political spectrum weaponize these kinds of issues for their own gains.
Yeah.
I will also note that I will just say, to be clear, there is one person who is worse than all others in terms of that, and that's our president. But yes, I take your point, but I do want to be clear that there is still an offender-in-chief in stoking animosity for
he seems to do it with an intentionality that's frightening, but I think that it would be a mistake to ignore the fact that it's not.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. And another thing that we've incentivized, it's not about individual actors as much as it is about incentives. And the ecosystem of the modern kind of news cycle has incentivized that. It's not about one or two bad actors, because bad actors will always be bad actors. It's a question of whether you set them up to succeed or fail.
Yeah, this could have been like an easy slam dunk to like really unite the country. I mean, even during the coronavirus, it could have been the same thing. But this guy he keeps missing these layups. These are like significant layups, but like
not missing. These are not misses.
Yeah, man. But I don't know. So yeah, I guess last point was I guess the thing right now is just the whole defunding police thing that. There's being more like, I don't know if you guys saw, but Minneapolis is like taking some pretty significant steps to do so. And I think it's...
Tell us about it, Alex, because I find this to be just endlessly fascinating.
Man, I don't...
Both as an actual concept and as a political ploy, because there's this is an interesting gambit.
Again, the point is to not get rid of the police. It's just to like kind of liberate the police of like the various burdens that are being placed on them. It's like police are like teachers. Like they no longer just teach. They're like protectors. They're like social workers. They're really... You know that better than most.
Yeah, as Alex has spent several years teaching.
And I'm going to say this straight up.
In an underserved community.
I'm going to say straight up. I was super unqualified to do half of those things outside of... I was barely qualified to do the thing that I was hired for.
And a great example of somebody who is an individual actor who had good intentions but was placed in a system that set him up to fail.
Yeah, it was not...
Perfect example.
It was like, that's the same thing with cops. Like, you can have the kindest person, the most well-intentioned, but they fall into this position where they're not set up for, to do the job that they thought they would be doing. Then it's why we are where we are. Like, the police are supposed to like somehow be the solution to homelessness and drug abuse and domestic violence. There's I think defunding the police is a great first step. It puts less money in like, this very powerful, very militarized like unit, like force in this country, and puts it can shift. They can use that money and shift it to the community, and that could look like so many different things, like having more social workers in a school, or having more after school programs, like just like the school that I taught in, like I had some after school programs, but it was tough because how long did it take for you guys to get to the schools that you went to, like from where you lived?
15 minutes?
15 minutes, yeah. 20 minutes walking for me. You know how long it took for my kids to get to their school? It took them an hour by bus. And then they had to they couldn't stay because their parents couldn't pick them up. And so a lot of the issues that vex the community, like Black community specifically, is just, I think, a lot of just lack of overall opportunities, and then also just biases within the system as well. But I think if you start with one, you can eventually pierce the other. But yeah, I can, there's a lot to kind of say about that, but I think right now it's a good first step. I think putting the community, empowering community is important right now.
Yeah, I agree, Alex. I think one thing that's interesting is that in my own research of defunding specifically, because at least for me, having not known much about this kind of idea prior to last week, I had a very early misconception of what I was hearing. Like I was hearing people yell, defund the police. And I think my reaction was similar to a lot of people's in that, like, we can't get rid of the police. And that's not at all what this is about. What's interesting, and now that I've spent some time looking into it, is that I think, and I don't want to speak for all police, and a lot of the things that I've looked at, police are very welcome to this kind of implementation. Like I think it was a chief of police it was Dallas. It was somewhere in Texas. And he was saying police are in charge of homelessness. He goes, and then he said, we've got a bad stray dog problem here. He's like, we've got police chasing dogs. Like the police are being asked to do so much. And I'll borrow a quote but they're not, it's not that they're not able to be qualified to do it. They just haven't been given the training. It's out of scope. It's out of scope work. And
it needs to be.
Yeah. And you're just not being given the right tools for the job. Imagine Mike, if I gave you a hammer and taught you how to hit nails. And then I said, can you go fix my sink? It's fucking absurd. And you'd want to have a plumber do that job, right? Like that's a really simplified way of thinking about it. But like, who's most frustrated in that scenario? Well, first of all, the person whose sink is still broken at the end of the day. But but the person who you just asked to do that job is going to be frustrated. And I imagine, and I don't want to say that all law enforcement officers feel this way, but I think probably many of them do. And at the end of the day, police defunding, really it's like the phrase itself is negative. It's saying we're taking money away from our
branding.
Police.
Really bad branding.
It's really giving money, and it's taking we listened to a podcast the other day. Dax talked to a guy who wrote a book called Upstream. It's taking money away from addressing the symptoms of a disease and looking at the upstream root of the problems. What if instead of having police officers try to tackle the distribution of drugs, and why don't we spend some money kind of tackling why people start to get into drugs in the first place, and like everyone benefits from it? I don't know. I think this is another one where I think if you really talk to people and depoliticized it and talked about the nuts and bolts of like where money is being allocated, I think most people are probably in agreement on this. Yeah. At the core of it.
No, I agree. It's I was speaking with a few people that are kind of, I think I'm more left leaning, probably am, and I was speaking with someone who's like probably a little bit more right leaning about this stuff, and just trying to explain, like when they heard defund the police, they're like, we can't do that. And I'm just like, no, listen. It's not get rid of the police. It's just reinvest the money. Like why do we need more policemen with like military grade weaponry when we can just get more like, I don't know, social workers? We can get more like community, like what was Obama again? A community activist or a community organizer, which again, I think he's the only person that's ever had that position. I've never actually met a community organizer. But yeah, just like more people that just want to like do direct good in the community. And it's like, maybe the police could actually do that themselves. Like instead of just like showing up with guns, like they can just maybe get training on to like have a dialogue with like a family that is going, like, with someone who has a drug problem, rather than just arrest them, like it's just, like that actually is not, I just talked that out of my ass, but that's actually not the worst idea, because at the same time, it could rebuild trust between, afflicted communities and the police. If they just show up and like are willing to have an open conversation and dialogue and not even bring their guns to the table, then that's better.
Do you mind if I insert here quickly, Alex?
Yeah.
I can't remember if you posted this or not, but it referenced a kind of like a case study of this very concept. I think it was in Camden, New Jersey, which like historically has had an absurdly high. It seems like you know what I'm talking about. So if you want to get into it, you take the reins.
You go.
But they were saying that it wasn't defunding. I think a better term would be refunding, because I think no one, like, they did lose some officers because they basically rebooted the system, and anyone that wanted their job back filled out some kind of like 50-page application, and almost all of them were reinstated. And they're like, the biggest thing they did, one that I could really get behind, was they changed the incentives. So like an officer was no longer measured by how many arrests they made. it's kind of amazing if you think about it. Like if you just change the incentives, the way people change their behavior. But to get back to your point, the overall shift in their mindset was that we're not warriors, we're guardians. And they increased like how much they would just send people into neighborhoods to get to know the people that they were protecting and guarding. And the statistic that they used to indicate progress, I thought was so cool. So they were talking about basically like solve percentage of open cases. And like oftentimes solve percentage is related, like really, really closely correlated with community trust. So like if someone's bike is stolen and you go into a community and you start knocking on doors and asking like, do you know who stole this bike? If you don't trust the people that are there to protect you, you're not going to say anything. And so cases go unsolved. And I'm not going to cite it specifically, but in like a 5 to 6 year period after implementation of this strategy, they went from like solving 16% of their cases to like 60%.
Wow.
And it was just like a huge increase in solve percentage, which correlates strongly with a huge increase in community trust. And like that had nothing to do with defunding the police. It was reallocating resources. And I think if we could call this whole thing reallocation, it would have such a better spin. It's
too many words,
right,
man.
It's just
too
such
many syllables.
Yeah.
I think we also, this is probably not a conversation for today, but like this is closely related to incarceration. And, you think about the overall budget of the United States and we're spending so much, of our money addressing the symptoms rather than the root causes. And you think about other, policing models in other countries. And I know that, there's a real sport in making fun of, European sort of pseudo-socialist states. They're kind of easy, fluffy targets. But, you look at the way policing is done in some of these Nordic countries, in the United Kingdom, they police very differently. Your typical patrol officer walking a beat does not carry a service rifle or a service revolver or a service weapon. That's not how that works. They walk around and they walk a beat. And that sends a very different message than an officer walking around armed to the teeth. And so I think, in one sense, what you guys are saying, just fundamentally sort of rethinking the process of what a police officer is beneficial both in terms of dollars and cents. And you can find the budget for getting more counseling services purely by reducing the number of people you lock up. Just start there. Lock up fewer people and suddenly you've got a lot of money to pay these, to pay for counseling services and to get somebody to do welfare checks who's not a police officer. Police officer should not be conducting a welfare check. You should have a counselor doing that. And the other thing that I would note that I think is interesting in this case is police unions. I would liken them to the MLB Players Union in that they have grown so powerful that I think in a lot of cases they no longer represent the needs and thoughts of the average member of their union. The MLB Players Union is currently committing baseball suicide. It's going through an act of self-immolation right now that is completely unnecessary and doesn't reflect what most of the players would want. But they're doing it because they become arrogant, fat, and happy because they have guaranteed contracts. And in a similar way, the various, policemen's societies and unions throughout the United States, and they're not, this is not an anti-union stance. It's just a right sizing of the unions, and it's a reconsideration of how these unions are set up. I don't know how, because I'm no expert on the topic of unions, but I think a big part of this problem is you have a force of lobbyists who control a lot of money and who can get any political official basically banned for life from local and state government the moment they propose cutting budgets to the police. And that's a problem. Because even if we don't think that defunding the police is a good idea, it's a worthwhile thought experiment. You have to concede that it's at least something worth thinking about. You have to say to yourself, as a person who is committed to finding the best solution for a problem, and this is something I do at work every day, and I'm sure you guys do too. Hey, what would happen if we got rid of this thing What would happen if we committed all of our resources to this thing as a thought experiment and then find the right spot in the middle? And that, even contemplating that publicly, is political career suicide in large part because of the power of these unions. It's a problem.
I mean, to going back to what you were saying earlier, if we just stopped stuffing more people in jails and prisons, you know who you have to face with that, right? It's not the police union. It's the fucking prison industrial complex, like for-profit private prisons. That's how they make their dough. That's literally fucking that warden from Shawshank Redemption, and like literally that guy. All right, they all like.
How can you be so obtuse?
Stop stuffing people in prisons. A week in the box.
I just don't think anybody can make a credible argument that there's not enough tax dollars to go around. I understand that the United States is in a budget deficit.
This is still the richest country in the world, though.
Economists, up our butt about that. If we really want to play that game, interest rates are so low that we can finance our debt at a very low rate. So, we can take on more debt. But there is enough money going from taxpayers to the state, local, federal governments. There is. I think we could agree on that. The going through the exercise of thinking about where it goes is thorny, it's complicated, and it will take generations to right size, even with really earnest effort. But it's insanely important.
Yeah. Oh, I think I just wanted, just with everything that's happened in the last few weeks, I feel like this country has hit a point of no return. I don't think when this is all said and done, whenever that is, who knows? The whole civil rights marches lasted a whole year. Who knows how long this could last, especially with quarantine and lockdown and the current recession. It's this could I think this country has hit a breaking point with what they're willing to put up with, especially right now, because a lot of people are frustrated with how things have been going. That this country, the police force, it's not. I don't think it's going to look the same when it's all said and done. If there's going to be something different, and hopefully that difference is significant and truly helpful.
Yeah, Alex, I want to I agree with you there. I'm also encouraged generally. I think that the fact that we're having this conversation makes me feel very optimistic about the process that takes time, but it makes me optimistic that these things can change if enough people care about it and vote and incentivize our politicians to make meaningful change. That's how this works. And it's a big system and it's a big machine. So it might take time, but I'm generally optimistic about it. And I'd like to take a second to say a big part of what makes me optimistic is I've been really impressed with you specifically and the way that you have been handling all this. I have really enjoyed seeing I look forward to seeing what you have to say about things on your Facebook. And I mentioned it briefly earlier, you posted a link to a really, really good NPR article that was really informative and comprehensive. I really enjoyed that. And the fact that you wanted to talk about this stuff with us now. So just in general, thanks for being the way that you have been about this and sharing what you know about it, because I think that's the way that these things eventually change, is by the biggest tool that we have is information, and you've done a really good job of seeking out the right stuff and sharing it. So that's my 2 cents on you.
And Kyle, I want to echo your note of optimism, because I think that this movement is shaping up to be pretty similar to the Me Too movement, in that there are excesses, there are overreaches, there's simplification by ideologues on both sides of a difficult issue. But by and large, what's happening is people who were not aware of a problem are becoming more acutely aware of it, are thinking about it more. Scumbags are coming out of the woodwork. We're seeing that they are scumbags. Good people are getting a better platform to prove themselves and how good they are. Allies are, being encouraged to come out. This is good. This is a really good thing. This is a reckoning that's been needed for a long time. And I think, to come back to what you're saying, Kyle, about Alex, I think Alex has always had a real social justice bent to his way of thinking. And I want to be clear to our listeners that, Alex has been thinking about these things for a long time with great compassion and intelligence, and it's really important and it's encouraging, and it's, Alex is just our buddy. Like, it's cool what we have access to, this kind of resource, somebody who's so knowledgeable and thoughtful, and you're just like our pal. We didn't even have to call up 1-800 Wikipedia. There's people all around us who are thinking about these topics really seriously, and just asking is really cool.
Yeah, I appreciate that, guys. Really, I don't, I honestly kind of just see myself as someone that's like super ignorant that just wants to like listen and learn as much as I can.
That's your gift.
That's the point.
But
that's kind of your gift.
It's just I don't know. I really, anyways, yeah. Just trying to like get all the information that's out there, even with people that I probably would disagree with. I've been listening to like a lot of like Black conservatives and kind of just their viewpoint on like racism and what they think is the cause of like a lot of things. And they, it's been interesting. Like the last few days, I've been just watching a lot of interviews and reading like texts about, how they feel about the George Floyd killing. And it's, it's just, I think now more than ever, it's important to have like a dialogue, not just with your buddies or like, your friends or whatever. It's important to like speak with everybody. Every now and then I see on people on Facebook posting how they're like, I blocked 20 people today, and it's like, well, so you're just like gonna let 20 people like live in their own thoughts? And for a minute I thought about saying ignorance, and maybe it is ignorance, but you don't really know a person until you like kind of develop that conversation. Like I don't know if you guys seen this, but it's on a lot of comedians have posted this story about Dave Chappelle. And just like Chappelle did a show, like this was before his comeback, but like it was in New York several years ago. And Chappelle, it was just on the eve of like, a lot of the police killings that happened in 2015. Yeah, it was after that. It was like days after, and there were still riots happening. And Chappelle did this comedy show, and he brought it up. He talked about the police killings, and this woman kind of just like in the audience said that, life's tough, deal with it. And, a lot of people were like this white woman, very well to do, like they were kind of commenting that she was dressed in a certain way, like very affluent dressed. But a lot of people would have been like, fuck this woman, we're never going to talk to her, and we're never, let her live, like let her think the way she does. But Dave didn't do that. Like he like had a dialogue with them. He talked about like just a lot of the things that afflict black people, from like top down. And in the end, he was able to like be an educator. Like he was supposed to like, he still had jokes because he's like Dave Chappelle, he's brilliant. But like he was still able to educate that woman. And in the end, instead of like, she didn't like storm off being like, fuck you, Dave Chappelle. She actually went back to the green room where comedians hang out. And as like an individual, she saw him out and was like, very, like apologetic. She was crying. She couldn't believe the things that she heard. And she like understood like where she was, like how she like was wrong. And then Dave was like, look, it's okay. It's now, what you can be part of the solution. Like that's like, it's a community effort, and you can't just like block out, the people that you disagree with, because in this country, that's like 40% of the country right there. You need that 40% to like, be on the side of like pushing change. And you can only do that if you have that conversation with them,
Yeah. It's a time for understanding. It's a time for grace.
Yeah.
Those are going to be important things.
Yeah. Like I don't want to be like, self-promoting here, but like my friend, she said this thing to me, which is that I'm glad I could talk with you because you don't resort to name calling or whatever. You don't like think I'm a racist for saying these things. And I truly don't, because this person is my friend and I know them and like I trust them, and you know what? They're entitled to their opinion, and I'm happy to like learn more. And like they've helped me learn some things as well. And so why can't you do the same for them, right?
Yep. If only everyone thought that way.
It's a big ask. You gotta, some people won't. It's not.
It's hard.
You ever like? It's so hard to convince people to like think differently, that think differently from you. To like, I'm not even asking them to think like me. I'm just asking them to kind of see where I'm coming from, and then help them inform a little bit more of where they could be. Like it's just. I'm not saying everyone has to think the same way, but I would like to like think that if you shared information and knowledge, that people would be accepting of that. And knowledge comes from a lot of different places, and so that's why I've just been listening to a lot of like kind of quote unquote the other side a little bit, especially Black conservatives, because I think their voices in this are just as important. I think it's their voice, like what they believe in, because unfortunately these guys kind of talk about how they get called a lot of unfavorable names, especially within the Black community.
There's a particular one,
yeah.
I'm sure, that you're talking about.
Yeah,
but I think that this sort of topic that you're bringing up about kind of convincing people and persuading people and the difficulty of that, I think we would be surprised, and everybody would be surprised at how open people are to persuasion given the opportunity to hear the right voices. And I think that's one of the really incredibly positive outcomes already of this whole situation, is that people are recognizing it's just really important to hear from people, to hear Black voices in this specifically. Like, it's more of those so-called Karens will be persuaded by hearing the stories and hearing the personal narratives and the thought processes of Black thinkers and Black people than I think most of us would expect. And I think if we give people the chance to be persuaded by elevating on a higher platform voices that haven't been heard, we'll be surprised by how much people can change.
Yeah, I agree. I think going back to something we mentioned earlier, like, the implicit bias training in that police department in Arizona, you can't go in guns blazing, just talking shit, like, even if you think it's true, and even if it is true, that's not how you bring about change, like if someone did the same thing to me, like calling me whatever, and I'm just like, I'm not going to want to work with this guy. And so you gotta be aware people are people, like, we're really not that different in the way how our opinions form, and, where our information, like where, like, the information that we read and how it informs our opinions it's not different. It's just, it manifests differently in the opinion, like the opinions that are formed, but the way it goes about it, it's not different at all.
As they say, you catch more honeys being fly.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not easy. It's actually very stressful to talk about, but it's also like, if you can change a person's mind, or like you can get them to think a different way, it's if you can pull it off, it's very gratifying.
Alex, this has been a delight. It's a tough topic. We appreciate it. We appreciate your candor, and you're exposing yourself to mean tweets from all of the various talk radio personalities who are, of course, listening to this. So apologies. Just at him directly. This was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thanks for asking me. I've been thinking about just, this conversation in general and what it's supposed to sound like, if it's supposed to sound like anything. I've been thinking about calling our good friend Dylan and just being like, pretending to be like innocuous and pretending it's like about nothing, and then to surprise him about this shit, I'd be like, got you, fuck, I got you, alright, we're gonna have this conversation. And just like overwhelm him. He's like, I thought we were talking about football. And it's just, nah.
I want to be clear, since you're gonna say that, I just want to actually say, Dylan, I actually sent Dylan a text, our good friend, right when this whole thing kind of started, thanking him for giving me the sort of courage to post on my social media about my thoughts on this topic. I don't really use my social media very much other than to just lurk. And typically disdainful of people who use their social media to promote really anything other than cute pictures of their relatives and cats and food and stuff. So my interests. But Dylan posted something and I was like, wow, Dylan is like me, somebody who kind of approaches social media that way. And if he felt strongly enough about this to post something, that gives me the courage to do the same thing. And so I was really impressed and empowered by that.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying Dylan wouldn't be able to
I
have
know
this
you're not,
conversation.
but I want to make sure we don't end on a note where we're joking about Dylan, because we make fun of him too much on this podcast.
Yeah, I'm coming for you, Dylan. Just you watch.
All right, so Kyle, do you want to walk us off here, play us off, Johnny?
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. This was not like necessarily fun, but I did enjoy talking with the three of us. So thanks for wanting to do it and giving it the attention that you did. This is normally the part where we would recap, but I don't think that's necessary at all. So we'll just skip to the thank yous. I'll thank Kevin MacLeod for our theme music. That shit's stanky. We skipped the not top 3 today, but he'll be back next week probably. And then I always thank my sister Erin for our artwork, which is stanky in its own right. And if you want to see more of Erin's stylings, Instagram is the place to do that. At Sand
And
Design.
speaking of that stanky Instagram, I want to thank our social media director, Caroline Labranti, my fiancée, for her work on our social media, particularly our Instagram. You can check that out at top10km on Instagram with the 10 spelled out TEN. If you want to check out her stuff, including coming soon, some of her first photos as a wedding photographer, you can check that out on cml.photos on Instagram. And if you're looking for another way to get in touch with the boys of Top 10, you can shoot us an email at top10km@gmail.com with the 10 spelled out TEN. I think particularly this week we'd love to, we're not expecting to generate a great national debate, but if anybody has anything they want to say or disagrees with anything we said, we'd love to hear from you. Legitimately, we'd love to hear from you. And if you want to come on to talk about any of this stuff, we would love to have you. And then finally, I'm sure you're listening to us on some sort of podcast app, but if you're looking for another one, we are on the Apple Podcast app, Stitcher, Spotify, Podbean. Alex is looking at himself in his camera, or pretty much wherever podcasts can be found. So, dogs, that's what I would say.
Che bella.
Arrivederci.
Wait,
Later, amigos.
Mike, I actually wanted to ask you something real quick, not related to anything we've just been talking about. Oh, let me end it right here.